am Helen Roberts. I'm co-leader, senior leader of Wellspring Church in Watford, and I am privileged to be coming from my home into your home as part of the Spring Harvest resources for 2020. Who would have thought we would be gathering at Spring Harvest like this? But a huge shout out to the Spring Harvest team for making this possible, and thank you for joining me for these next few minutes as we talk about something that has burned in my heart for a while and that I believe the Holy Spirit wants to burn in yours. That is, we're going to be talking about escaping comparison. Now, I admit I'm speaking mainly to the women here, but guys, if you're sat on your sofa, don't leave. We want you to stay connected with this conversation because, quite frankly, we're going to need your help. So we want to talk about the comparison trap. This is the title of my new book, in fact, The Comparison Trap. And I'm going to be teaching from some of this book now. So I really hope you will join in a conversation. And I'm going to start with a confession, if I might. When I was writing this book, I was in my study space, I was in the flow of writing, and my children needed feeding, which is not unusual. You know, we all get hungry, right? So I just made a quick dash into the kitchen, delved into the back of the freezer, found some burgers that were a little bit unidentifiable because they had been out of the main pack and were cling filmed and all, but decided this was a quick fix, slung them in the oven, everything was ready, threw the food. Oh gosh, I sound like a terrible chef. Well, who knows? Gave the food lovingly to my cherubs and thought dinner was great, and I cracked on with my writing. Little did I know at midnight, that very same 24-hour period, there would be synchronized vomiting from my children. Oh gosh, I hope you're not watching this while you have your meals. Sorry, should have given you a warning. Anyway, there was synchronized vomiting amongst my children, and I had clearly given them food poisoning from their, unidentifiable burgers that were the quick fix. And sometimes I think we need to pause a bit, like I should have paused then, to consider what narrative are we feeding our children. You see, I've come to realise there is a narrative in our culture that sets women up to fail because it sets us up to compete with one another. It sets us up to compare ourselves with one another and get trapped in that comparison, fueling jealousy. But I've also come to realise, and this is the good news, that God has a different narrative for us. God does not want anyone gripped with comparison fueling jealousy. He wants us to live beyond that, incomparably free, confident in who we are in Him, who He is to us, and so much so that we're able to champion all other women, whether they're close circle friends or whether they're far distant friends we just see on a distant screen or anything, to be able to champion one another as women. Now, consider the narrative our children are growing up with. Now, please don't think I'm just about to diss on all of Disney and, crush all of the fairy tales in the world. But let's just think about fairy tales, can we, for a minute? Cinderella, trapped by her wicked stepmother and bullied by her two ugly stepsisters. Snow White, sent off as if to die by her wicked stepmother. Rapunzel is locked up in the tower by the wicked stepmother. There are so many fairy tales that we take for granted that set up this story, this narrative, that where there is a great woman, there is always lurking nearby a wicked woman. And we take that kind of once upon a time make-believe fairy tale into our real life narrative as a culture. Let me just throw some real princess names at you and you'll know what I've been thinking about. So Princess Diana was set up in the media as being not friends with Sarah Ferguson when they were both in the royal household. And Sarah Ferguson has gone on to say that was never true. But she has observed, and we can all observe, that is repeating itself with our modern day princesses, with Kate and Meghan. There is a narrative that says women can't get on, women have jealousy, women will fight and compare and get trapped up. But why is that? Is that something that we're just predisposed to? Is that something we just have to give into? Or can we stand up and make a difference? Imagine, ladies, in this lockdown season, if we treat this cocoon that we're in, where we can't go out, imagine if we could transform so that when we come out of this, we're ready for a whole brand new world to champion one another and to live free of comparison. So you might remember the Bible stories of the narrative right in the beginning. Let me read to you from Genesis, just a little verse. You remember the time when sin entered the world? Everything went horribly wrong. Adam and Eve were hiding. Then they came out and they had to face the consequences and kind of have this conversation with God. And there were consequences to their sinful, selfish actions. These consequences are what we understand and know as the curse. And God spoke to the enemy, he spoke to Adam, he spoke to Eve. But this is what he said when he spoke to the serpent, who was representing the devil. He said this: because you've done this, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. That's in Genesis 3:15. Now, obviously, the woman's offspring are both male and female. But what we see here is a glimpse into a strategy, a mandate that the enemy has been living with ever since. That is, he has a particular animosity towards women. You can see that on a global scale. The majority of atrocities would land towards women, from the sex trade and human trafficking and the restrictions for education, and the list goes on. There's a whole heap of atrocities that are being expressed as the enemy's strategy gets played out. He really doesn't like women. And then there's this generational impact that happens into our children's lives, much like my food poisoning impacted my children. So we have this at the very beginning of our story. But God has this amazing plan. Now, one other thing to recognize is womanhood is this huge spectrum. We are all so vastly different, not only in our physicality, but in our emotional makeup, in our spiritual, in our kind of characters. We've just got this huge spectrum of womanhood. So to compare and try and be like someone else is, at the very get-go, an unrealistic objective, because we're all so different. Now, psychologists have studied our brains. They've studied our habits, they've studied our behavior, and it's not always good news what they've studied and what they've found. So some of the things that they've discovered, and this might not be that comfortable to hear, but this is what the science is showing. Some of the studies show that when females all work together, it can normally go really well. The challenge is actually when you have a male-dominated environment. Stick with me, guys, I'm not anti-men, but when you have a male-dominated working environment and you just put in one or two women, so not many women have made it through to the same levels as the guys. So you get, some people would call that tokenism, where you get just one or two women breaking through. What happens then, the psychologists have been able to discover, is that women, in order to get where they want to go, to reach their career potentials, they don't compete against the men, they compete against the woman as if she is a threat to their success. Apparently there are some primal urges within all of us to have our progression and to have our generational progression. So basically mates and promotion, we see is held by the power by men. Now, that can be a challenge if men hold all the solutions, but some women stand in the way. You then get this working environment compounded. Now, there's a thing called system justification, and this is a psychological factor where women, well, in fairness, it goes always, but in terms of comparison, we're looking at women, where there's a unfairness in a group that they kind of reinforce. So it's like a long oppressed group struggle to make sense of what is unfair in their world, and they internalize the negative stereotypes and kind of feed it and fuel it. There's a psychologist, a researcher professor called Brené Brown. She says this, she says, our brains dress, rehearse conspiracies. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, there's so many different stories, but even, remember the prodigal son story, as the prodigal son was journeying back to the father, and he's dress rehearsing what he's going to say to his dad. We do that. Our brains do that. We dress rehearse. Even in this lockdown season, you might have found yourself dress rehearsing some of the things you might say at the Tesco delivery place, you know, for trying to beg to have your toilet rolls. Or you might have dress rehearsed what you're going to say to a loved one and when you're going to speak to them. But we can dress rehearse negative stuff, which kind of fuels it in a potentially unhelpful way. Maybe we could dress rehearse some good stuff in due course. Now, add to this one more challenge. This challenge is our propensity to absorb negative comments really deeply, but let positive comments just kind of brush off of us like they don't happen. Let me help you think about what I mean by this. Imagine going out for a day. We could just pause there, couldn't we? Imagine back when we weren't locked in and we could just go out and you could have a day with your friends. Everything could be going really, really well. Everybody's saying lovely things. And then one comment just at the end of the day, or one comment by somebody that is negative, and you can come away from that whole beautiful day thinking, they don't like me. It's all over. I'm not good. This is all terrible. And I can definitely do this. I can definitely do this in my home life. Gosh, my husband is very good at saying very positive things to me, but they can sometimes brush off. But if he says one negative thing, well, I will home in on that and I will take that in deep. We have this negative bias, and it's this positive negative asymmetry which sets us up to compete and compare. Now, this comparison trap is nothing new. This comparison we can read right back in Genesis, not just where we're set up with animosity for the devil, but there is this particular story about two sisters who marry the same guy. Have you heard the story about Rachel and Leah? They were Laban's daughters, and they both ended up marrying Jacob, which that in of itself, trouble right there, right? But they were set up and they were getting married, but this is how they're described right at the beginning. So in Genesis 29, you can find the story, and verse 16 is where we first hear about these girls, really. And it says this: now Laban had two daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Oh my gosh, right there. They're completely described. They're completely compared. One beautiful, sparkly-eyed, lovely figure, everything working, and the other one, it's not happening. Now, that physical comparison goes into their relationship. It goes into their marriages. But the challenge comes because they begin to compete and compare and fuel jealousy between themselves. You might remember the story because they begin to try and have children. Now, this is where God is amazing. I mean, he's amazing all the time, right? But this is where he's really amazing. In chapter 29, verse 31, this is what the author of Genesis captured. He says this: when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he enabled her to have children, but Rachel could not conceive. Now, this is amazing. And arguably, this is one of the first keys to our escaping the comparison trap. And that is, everybody has something. Now, in the context of those days, it was really about your looks or about your babies. So that's why the two things are only limited there. In our context and culture, obviously, there is so much more that we can contribute in, serve in, do, achieve. So we're not just limiting ourselves to how we look and how many babies we produce. But the point is, God blessed both women. They both had something. The value for Rachel that she was loved by her husband so much meant that she was safe and secure. But the value to Leah of being able to conceive children meant that she was also safe, because it was a whole economical thing that was linked to having babies. God gave every woman something unique, something that was blessed, something that could have enabled gratitude and contentment to rise to the surface, but instead they squashed that and fueled jealousy. Every one of us has something. Now, as they were going through, they named their children, and all these different names all have different meanings. And you can see the condition of these women's hearts as they go through producing their children. So in chapter 30, we're reading about their babies. Now, Rachel was so desperate to have a child that she pleaded with her husband, saying, "Give me children or I'll die." The sadness with this is because in her second delivery, she did die. Her desire to have children that she thought would kill her was ultimately satisfied, but it cost her her life. In verse 8 of the same chapter, verse 30, we've got this little insight. Rachel's had a baby at this point via her maidservant Bilhah, and she's called this child Naphtali. And this is what Naphtali's name means. It says this: I have struggled hard with my sister and I'm winning. I mean, come on. She has named her child after her fueled jealousy, after the comparison trap, and she thinks she's winning in this moment. Later on in verse 13, Leah has had a child by now, and she's called this child Asher. And this is the translation. She's going, what joy is mine, because Asher has a connection with the name joy. And then she says, now the other women will celebrate with me, as if she was being deprived of relationships that were championing her amongst the other women, as if her friendships were limited by the comparison and the jealousy that was gripping her heart. This is like tragedy unfolded in the naming of their children. Now, I'm sure I'd love to say this has never happened to any of us, but I have another confession. Back in 2001, which I know is quite a few years ago, I was at a stage in our life. We had one daughter who was getting to about the age of 4, and she was in school, and we should have been really grateful. I should have been really grateful and content, but I wanted more children. So did my husband, so we were onto a winner. But we wanted more children, but I went into secondary infertility and couldn't conceive. And this went on for a number of years. And one day I was walking round our town centre shopping mall. Oh, imagine the days we could do that. But anyway, back to the room. I was walking around the shopping centre, and honestly, it was as if every single person in that mall was pregnant, even the men. Everyone was pregnant. And I was going around seeing all these pregnant women and allowing that to fuel in my heart jealousy. You see, jealousy is not only wanting what somebody else has, but it's a sense of entitlement that feels that what they have should be yours. So I was feeling this entitlement was being wronged. I should have been a mother again. I should have satisfied my daughter's request for a brother or sister. I should have been able to produce life, but I couldn't. And it was fueling and burning within me. Now, at that time, my beautiful sister said a comment to me, which I don't remember what it was, but I remember not liking it at the time, and it's something to do with children. And she was pregnant with her 3rd child. So I decided, in my wisdom, or lack of wisdom, I decided to write to my sister a letter to explain why she said what she said had hurt me, and how unfair it was. You know, she was on to baby 3 and I had stopped at baby 1. What a terrible thing I did that day when I wrote this letter. It was like I poured out all the toxicity of my jealousy, all the ugly of my own sin, and I poured it into the pages. You know, this was the day when we, pen and ink, poured it into the pages and posted this time bomb to my sister. Nowadays, of course, we just press send and time bombs get there much quicker. But I sent it, the old-fashioned way. And this letter landed in my sister's home, and as she opened it, I hurt her. From all those miles away, I hurt her because I poured my lack of contentment and my lack of gratitude for what I did have. There were 1,000,001 things I could have been thanking God for the day. I could have been thanking God for the one daughter I had who was healthy and vibrant and loving. I could have been thanking the Lord for my husband who passionately loves me and is, a friend for life. I could have been thanking him that I've been healed of secondary terminal cancer. I mean, for goodness sake, how did I forget to be thankful for that? I could have been thankful that I had a home to live in. I could have been thankful that I had a job and a purpose. I could have been thankful for millions and millions of things, but instead I forgot all of that, and all I could focus on was what I didn't have and what somebody else had and how I felt entitled. I honestly was no better than Rachel and Leah, because I fueled jealousy in my heart. Now, have you ever considered the health of your relationships with the women in your world can have impact on your faith and on even the mission of the church? There's a letter in the Bible that Paul wrote to the Philippians. So the believers who lived in Philippi received this letter from him. His letter was not toxic like my letter. His letter was beautiful. But just at the end of his letter, when this was being first read out to the gathered believers in Philippi, 2 women were called out who would suddenly have been sitting up in their little church context thinking, oh my gosh, Paul has heard about us. So you know how there are stories, and at the end of his letters, he's often giving big shout outs and saying, thank you to this person and look after this person and yay for this person. Well, at the end of Philippians in chapter 4, you get this call out that I would not have wanted to be one of these women. So these women were called Euodia and Syntyche. And this is what Paul says to the believers in Philippi. Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche. Please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women, for they worked hard with me in telling others the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are written in the book of life. So let's just pause that story. Here we have these two women whose relationship has become so contested with each other that the actual gospel was being prohibited from being talked about. So he's talking about the book of life that has believers' names in it. Now, I don't think for 1 minute their names are being etched out of the book of life because of what they were doing and saying with each other. But what if other people's names were not being added because of how these two women were behaving was stopping the gospel from being told about, was stopping the gospel from looking and sounding good, because these two women in the church who were co-workers with Paul, who'd been on mission with him, who'd been part of his team, were now at each other's throats in whatever way that he's heard about it from where he was writing the letter saying, goodness, ladies, what is this disagreement between you? Come onto the same team. Be a co-worker again in the great mission of Jesus, because other people's future is depending on it, and you are putting people off from the kingdom of Christ. What a responsibility that would be. They could have been witnesses for Jesus, saying what they had seen and heard Jesus had done. Instead, they were arguing and competing and trapping one another in this painful pursuit of their argument. Now, they needed help, and quite frankly, some of us might need help sometimes too. There's one other story, let me just make a nod to it. We won't go there in the Bibles, but maybe you could look at this in your own time, and that is the story of Ruth. In the story of Ruth, you have this mother-in-law called Naomi, who her husband passes away, and then her two daughter-in-laws, who were married to her own sons, the sons pass away, leaving literally the mother and the two daughters-in-law. So they were living outside of their homeland. They were living in a place called Moab, and the daughters were from Moab. And Naomi decided she was going to go home. And initially, both girls set out with her. But then Naomi said, no, you go back to your home. And you might remember this story, because what happened was, Orpah went home. And she said, thank you very much. I'm going back to Moab. Thank you for your blessing. But Ruth said, no, I'm going to stay with you, Naomi. I'm going to stay. And she said these amazing words. She said, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And she aligned herself to Naomi in such a profound, life-changing way. There's a key here that we can lean into, understand a little bit more about how women can come to a place of championing one another. And that is when we can say, no, do you know what? Your people will be my people. What you have will become mine. Not in a snatchy way, but in a, I'm going to champion you. I'm going to come alongside you. The story goes on, and they turn from destitute to restored. And near the end of the very short story, Ruth, who has become married again, she has a baby. And there's a beautiful bit at the end of the story where Naomi takes her grandbaby to her chest and holds this little one, saying as if, this baby as if mine. Now, I don't mean in a weird baby snatching way. I mean in a Ruth's fruitfulness enabled Naomi to step into her new fruitfulness. Naomi didn't need to have another baby herself. She was just fulfilled in seeing Ruth have a baby for herself. She didn't need to experience it firsthand. She could celebrate it alongside. Imagine if I had been more like Naomi. Imagine if I had just celebrated all the babies around me that other women were having, rather than allowing my jealousy and lack to fuel my feelings of jealousy and comparison. So here, just to wrap this up, I've got some keys that we can all have to escape comparison. The first one is to grow in gratitude rather than fuel jealousy. If we could but pause and recognise, like Rachel and Leah both had something, what do we have? What do you have that makes you uniquely you? What thought processes do you go through that make you uniquely you? What gifts and skills and abilities do you have that make you uniquely you? We want to celebrate those, but first, can you celebrate them? Can you grow in gratitude for what you have and allow that to percolate through into all your relationships? The second is to celebrate who others are and what they have. Again, with Rachel and Leah, Rachel could have celebrated Leah's fruitfulness, but instead she chose entitlement and jealousy. I could have celebrated what my sister had. Instead, I chose entitlement and jealousy, and it damages relationships. So can we celebrate other people's successes and skills and the things that are going on? And lastly, like with Judith and Syntyche, can we walk as a witness? Now, you know this. A witness is somebody in a court of law who says what they see. A judge is the one who brings about the edicts and brings about the outcomes. But a witness simply says what he or she sees or has seen or heard. And we're called to be witnesses for Jesus. So in our relationships, can we begin to be women who say what we see Jesus doing in each other's lives? Not what we think he should be doing, not what we wish he had done, not what that person has or hasn't done, but can we begin to celebrate what Jesus has done in each other's lives? Because as we begin to celebrate each other, we will shake off the chains of comparison that trap us up. As we begin to see what Jesus is doing, we come to a place of incredible freedom to be who he has called us and created us to be. Last year, I took a sabbatical, and I was over in America as part of my sabbatical, and I went up on this mountain retreat. Now, it was like 48 hours of a fasting retreat in the mountains. What's not to love? Although I was completely out of my comfort zone because I was utterly convinced that some American bears were going to come from the mountains and I would be their dinner. But that didn't happen, clearly. But anyway, I was in this mountain, and in this sort of retreat place, there were these prayer caves. These were like brick outhouses built into the rocks of the mountain. And I felt the Lord say to me, Helen, I want to meet with you in one of those prayer caves. And I was like, okay. So I packed up a little, my little rucksack with my peppermint tea and my Bible and my notebook, and wandered off to find these prayer caves in the mountains, looking out for bears as I walked. No bears on the way. Got to the prayer cave. Now, there were no windows in this prayer cave. There was this wooden door and this brick wall leaning into the mountains of the rocky side. And as I opened this wooden door and creaky, the light from the outside world poured into this little prayer cave. And no kidding, the whole of the ground, all of the flooring went and started to move, because all of the bugs that had been having a party in the dark suddenly had this light coming in on them, which they didn't like, and they were beginning to scurry to the edges. And honestly, I stood out there saying, really, God? Really? I don't want an appointment with you in there. I would rather just stay out here. But all the time I felt the Lord saying, I want to speak to you in there, Helen. I want to speak to you. So there was this bench thing, but there was no way I was going to be sitting down. God could speak to me standing up. Thank you very much. So I stepped inside this prayer cave and just, held every orifice a little bit tighter so that no bugs could go anywhere. And then I began to say to the Lord, okay, what do you want me to say? And what the Lord reminded me of was when Jesus was in a cave. Now, when Jesus was in a cave, it was because he was dead and his body was wrapped in the linen cloths and he'd been laid out, having died on the cross for us. And there came a time when those grave clothes that were appropriate for his deadness, that had wrapped him up, they were appropriate. There came a time when Jesus breathed again and he came back to life, having defeated death. And he didn't need those grave clothes anymore, so he folded them up and left them no longer needed. They were needed for 3 days, but they're no longer needed. And he left, resurrected, very much alive. And in my prayer cave, with the bugs still scurrying around my feet, I felt the Lord say to me, Helen, there are some things that you are still carrying that served you for a season. Wrappings of disappointment that might have protected your heart, or pain of things that have not happened that might have really not happened, and so they were relevant pains, or disappointments with friendships that were real situations, so they weren't to be denied, but you don't need them anymore. And I felt the Lord say to me, Helen, I want you, as you step out of this cave, to imagine those grave clothes, those signs of death, those signs of a season that you're not in anymore. Imagine leaving them behind and step out into freedom. Ladies, this is what I want to invite you to do right now. As Spring Harvest is in your home, from my home to your home, is to say, would you leave behind some of the things that have wrapped you up that you don't need anymore? Would you shake off the disappointments? Would you shake off the pain? Would you shake off the jealousies? Would you shake off the comparisons and that feeling of inadequacy and that imposter syndrome that keeps rearing its head? Would you shake it off and say, okay, I'm going to leave that season behind? And as I come out of this prayer cave, like one day we will come out of lockdown, when we come out of this cocoon, to come into the freedom that Christ died for us. Would you allow gratitude to rise up within you and to reflect and think on the amazing things that make you you? Would you begin to look for the good things in other women and champion them, celebrate them? And would you begin to walk as a witness where you will say what Jesus does because you can see what he's doing in other women's lives? Will you pray with me just for a minute? Father, I want to thank you for every woman and every other person who is connected with this time together. And Lord, I pray for a breakout from anything that would hold us in a comparison trap, a break free from any grave clothes that keep us bound up. And I pray, Lord, like your word says in Psalm 139, that there will be a greater awareness amongst us that we're all fearfully and wonderfully made. We're wonderfully complex, but we're wonderfully made. And I pray that the same thoughts captured in Psalm 139 that says, your thoughts about us are precious and too numerous to count. Lord, I pray that every woman listening to this will realise how precious your thoughts are towards them. And you have so many precious thoughts towards them that we can't even count those thoughts. Lord, would you bless us and set us free from the comparison trap? In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for joining with me. Do keep connected with all of the resources that Spring Harvest are bringing from our homes to yours, and be blessed.